Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 4, Episode 16, King Philip's War. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Sam Hume. Last time, we saw how relations between the United Colonies of New England, particularly Plymouth, and the Wampanoag under Sachem Philip, collapsed under the weight of an apparent murder. John Sachem, a Christian Indian, interpreter and professional document witness, was found dead in a frozen pond. On the testimony of one witness, 3 men were charged and convicted of his murder and executed in Plymouth. They were close advisers of Philip, who did not take kindly to either the accusation that he was behind Sachem's death, or that the English colonies had any jurisdiction to execute his people. Despite the efforts of Rhode Islanders to avoid war, it appeared to be unavoidable, or at least Plymouth Governor Josiah Winslow was determined not to avoid it. He planned to march on Philip's home of Montauk, or Mount Hope as the English called it, capture or kill the Wampanoag Sachem, and assert undisputed colonial power over their indigenous neighbours. But, despite Winslow's hopes, he wouldn't be the one to make the first move. In June 1675, a group of Wampanoag men arrived in the small village of Swansea, near Montauk. They came to have their hatchets sharpened by the smith, but it was a Sunday, a Sabbath, and the blacksmith was a God-fearing Puritan, and he wasn't going to work on the Sabbath. They argued, and the Wampanoag got violent, breaking into a house to steal food as the people of Swansea retreated to a fortified house. The next day, the Wampanoag returned, killed English cattle, and broke into another house. William and John Salisbury, father and son, saw this happening and fired at the Indians as they ran away. One was hit and fell down wounded, but got up and got away. Wampanoag messengers came to the fortified house later that day and informed them that the man had died from his wounds. This was bad enough, but then John Salisbury piped up and told them, quote, "It was no matter." His dad immediately tried to smooth this over. It was just, quote, "an idle lad's words." But the Wampanoag quickly left, and the people of Swansea slept in the fortified house. Before their man was killed, Wampanoag violence had been demonstrative. They targeted English property, English cattle, they burned English houses and stole English food. As we're well aware of by now, cattle and houses were physical displays of colonial expansion and resented by their native neighbours. In the aftermath of Sachem's death and the execution of his supposed murderers, tensions were incredibly high, and the dispute with the blacksmith was the spark for violent protest. Involving violent property damage or not, the Wampanoag saw this as protest. Shooting and killing one of them may have seemed to the English as justified self-defence, but to the Wampanoag it was an escalation. When there wasn't any suggestion of a settlement or repayment or even sympathy for the death, that demanded revenge. The next day, John and William Salisbury and 4 other colonists who were collecting food from one of Swansea's houses were ambushed and killed. This was targeted revenge, but now the Wampanoag escalated. Later that day, an English sentry was shot, and when Swansea sent 2 messengers to a nearby town to request a surgeon, they were killed on the road. Philip likely had no hand in either the initial raid on Swansea or the subsequent killings. As we saw last time, he was still hoping that Easton's proposed arbitration might resolve the growing tensions. It was too late for that now. Just days after Swansea was first attacked, other Wampanoag raided the town of Mattapoisett, killing 5 colonists and bringing their heads to Philip. Elsewhere in New England, wheels were turning. Besides the Wampanoag, the other large indigenous nations in New England were the Narragansett and their enemies, the Mohegans. The Narragansett and the English met at the end of June. Representatives from Massachusetts and Rhode Island met with the Narragansett Sachem, Quissaquanch, or Canonicus. The colonists came to try and convince the Narragansett not to ally with Philip and the Wampanoag in the brewing war. Canonicus insisted that he had no alliance with Philip, nor had the Narragansett sent any fighters to join with the Wampanoag. But he asked a pointed question. This was a fight between the Wampanoag and Plymouth, and the colonists were asking the Narragansetts to stay out of it. So why were Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and the other New England colonies preparing to fight for Plymouth? Surely this was an escalation, and one which might easily spread the violence to Narragansett lands. The colonial representatives replied that, as they were all Englishmen and subject to the same king, they had to support Plymouth. Canonicus countered that supporting one's allies is indeed a very good thing. So would Rhode Island and Massachusetts support the Narragansett as allies against their neighbouring Mohegan? The Mohegans had killed a Narragansett sachem, and they wanted justice. Since Rhode Island and Massachusetts were preparing for war over John Sachem, who was nowhere near as important as a sachem, then surely they would help the Narragansett in their conflict with the Mohegan. If not, well, then maybe Rhode Island and Massachusetts should stay out of the conflict between Philip and Plymouth. Now, this was not what the colonists had expected when they'd arranged this meeting. They'd meant to pressure the Narragansett to stay out of the brewing war. Instead, they went away with a flea in their ear telling them to stay out of Plymouth's war. Colonial worries that the Narragansett might just join the war against them ratcheted up a notch. Another diplomatic mission was sent to the Nipmuc, whose land was roughly north of the Narragansett and Mohegan, and which had a number of praying towns along the road between Massachusetts and Connecticut. These praying towns, like James Printer's home of Hassanemeset, were visited by Ephraim Curtis, a trader and messenger from Boston. Curtis asked if they'd heard about the troubles down south, where Philip was causing issues. At Hassanemeset, the town's leader assured Curtis that they wanted nothing to do with Philip. None of the townspeople had joined with him, and why would they? They were Christians and, quote, accounted themselves as the English, and they would not fight against themselves, end quote. Lisa Brooks highlights another cultural difference here. For the praying towns, quote, their close political and religious ties with Massachusetts made their English neighbours like kin, and they would not fight against themselves, their own. It is essential to understand that English constructions of race, particularly the distinction between groups of people based on skin colour and other physical attributes, as well as geographic origins, were only beginning to enter native space. Nipmuc converts had little reason to account themselves loyal to Metacom on the basis of shared race or ethnicity, or, for that matter, out of a sense of amor patriae or nationalistic patriotism. Their responsibility was to honour the relationships of alliance made with neighbouring nations, and in this case, their stronger loyalty was to the English of Massachusetts, regardless of their national or ethnic origins, end quote. But as we'll see, this understanding was not shared by colonial leaders, who suspected that Christian Indians remained Indians first, Christians second. On the 28th of June, 3 militia companies arrived in Swansea. Josiah Winslow, governor of Plymouth, had already been preparing for war when the news reached him of the first raid on Swansea. Before the violence escalated into bloodshed, he'd already ordered his militia to gather at the town. Swansea would be a staging post for the advance on Montauk. On the 28th of June, the soldiers arrived, more than 350 infantry and cavalry, under the command of Captain Benjamin Church. Church found Swansea under siege, its small garrison holed up out of fear ever since their sentry had been shot. Church was disappointed by their timidity, and he resolved to take the fight to the Indians. Just outside of Swansea was a bridge over the river Soames, and beyond that bridge was a narrow path which led to Philip's home of Montauk. Church led 12 horsemen, including a guide, to cross that bridge and scout out Montauk. Or at least that was the plan, because it turns out the Swansea garrison had been doing the sensible thing by hiding. As soon as the party crossed the bridge, the bushes and trees erupted in a barrage of gunfire. Wampanoag fighters were not blind to the build-up of forces in Swansea, and they'd been keeping watch on the road to Montauk. After the barrage, the Native Americans didn't hang around to try and reload and risk getting into an extended fight with cavalry. They withdrew in the chaos, easily losing the few soldiers who were uninjured and angry enough to try and chase them. Exactly what Church's plan had been is unclear. He seems to have expected to be able to just ride up to Montauk, find Philip, and maybe scare him into submission, ending the war before it really began. Instead, his guide had been shot dead and 2 others were wounded. The next day, a group of Wampanoag snuck into Swansea and began to mock the English garrison. It was bait, and the colonists took it. Racing out of the stronghouse, they crossed the river in force and formed up for battle. But it was raining, and with the rough terrain and poor light, combined with everyone being understandably on edge and expecting another ambush, someone lost their nerve. They fired into the bushes, and soon everyone was shooting. In the confusion, the only people hit by English bullets were English. The Wampanoag were nowhere near. This event was later embellished in colonial accounts as a battle, where at least 5 Indians were killed before the rest ran away in terror, but contemporary accounts don't mention any of that. What they do include is that when Thomas Savage, the commander of the Massachusetts militia, arrived later that night, Church had to awkwardly explain why Savage's son had a bullet in his leg. Now that Plymouth was reinforced by Massachusetts, the next day the combined force set out, once again, over the bridge. There was no ambush waiting for them, and they slowly, carefully, moved up the road to Montauk. Then the column came to a halt in stunned horror at what awaited them. A wooden fence, supported by 8 long poles, had been built along the road, and on each pole was a head. The rotting, disfigured, mutilated heads of English settlers, including the 5 killed at Mattapoisett. In this grisly sight, Lisa Brooks sees more than just a warning to the colonists. She argues that by building a fence, the Wampanoag were mocking the fence-building English, and by placing the heads on spikes, they were treating the dead settlers as criminals, just like the English did with executed convicts. Shaken, the united colonial force kept moving, alert for an ambush which never came. 2 miles down the road, they finally reached Montauk. The political centre of the Wampanoag Confederacy, the home of its Sachem Philip, was empty. The Wampanoag and King Philip had vanished. Where Philip had gone was a mystery. Montauk sat on a peninsula, with Narragansett Bay to its west and south, and Mount Hope Bay to its east. With Swansea to its north, and Rhode Island ships patrolling the coast, the colonists thought they had Philip bottled up, ready to destroy him at their leisure. When they returned to Swansea, Captain Savage claimed they had captured Montauk, which, in a manner of speaking, was true, but this was definitely trying to put a positive spin on things. Because the mission wasn't to capture Montauk, the mission was to capture Philip, and Philip had disappeared. So where had Philip and the Wampanoag gone? After building their grisly fence, Philip and his people packed up what they could carry, loaded it into boats, and, shrouded by the poor weather, rowed across the bay to Pocasset and the protection of his sister-in-law, Weetamoo. Despite the efforts of Governor Winslow to cut the ties between them, Weetamoo now allowed Philip to base his war effort on her land. Now the fighting seemed to be everywhere. Villages like Taunton and Rehoboth were raided. Wampanoag warriors slaughtered cattle, burned houses and barns, destroyed crops, and killed every colonist they could find. And now Swansea was attacked again. As Brooks points out, most of these raids were against settlements on land which was disputed by their native neighbours. Most colonial forces in this area had to spread out, trying to defend everything, but defending nothing, and always on the lookout for Philip. something which Jill Lepore notices in English accounts of this raid or that attack on English towns. They almost always lead with the number of houses burned before mentioning how many people were killed. Something she spends some time discussing is the symbolic and cultural importance of houses to the colonists. In colonial mythology, only half a century old but already taking root, they'd arrived in an empty land and made their mark on it with their houses. As we've seen already, the idea of improving the land, building on it, farming it, taming it, became both an incentive and a justification for English expansion. They had a very good reason for caring whether houses had been destroyed. It could be the difference between life and death. But to quote directly from Lepore now, there was more to the colonists' concern than simple practicality. English possessions were, in a sense, what was at stake in the war. For these, the clothes they wore, the houses they lived in, the things they owned, were a good part of what differentiated the English from the Indians. These were not simply material differences, they were cultural. For every English frock coat was stitched with threads of civility. Every thatched roof rested on a foundation of property rights, and every cupboard housed a universe of ideas. It's an interesting idea, and one we'll return to. Elsewhere, the bulk of Massachusetts' militia headed west. The reluctance of the Sachem of the Narragansett, Canonicus, to completely disavow the Wampanoag now brought a united colony army to their territory. Led by Edward Hutchinson, son of Anne Hutchinson, the force summoned Canonicus and other leading Narragansett to a meeting with the intention, to quote from William Hubbard's History of the War, make a peace with a sword in their hands. Hutchinson chose Petaquamscut as the location for this meeting, which was land he had previously tried to force the Narragansett to sell to him. The Narragansett had to be made to submit, and when Canonicus arrived, he'd be overawed by the 100 militiamen. That arrival would be any day now. Any day. Are we sure Canonicus got the summons? He did. Send another. Because it turns out Canonicus and the Narragansett weren't stupid. They knew Hutchinson. They knew what he was like and what he wanted. So rather than attend a meeting where they expected they'd be made to agree, under threat of force, to something they'd rather not agree to, Canonicus and his fellow sachems just didn't RSVP. After days of waiting, Hutchinson finally accepted that Canonicus just wasn't going to show. So he made do. 4 Narragansett men were found and brought to the meeting, where they were declared to be attorneys on behalf of their sachems. These attorneys were made to sign a treaty which required the Narragansett to hand over any Wampanoag in their territory to the English, to join the English in their war against Philip, to send scouts and guides to assist United Colony militias, to return any stolen English goods, and to never harm English cattle again. Not about to miss the opportunity, Hutchinson added an extra clause. The Narragansett would acknowledge his claims on Petaquamscut. This treaty would have been quite the diplomatic coup for the colonies, if the men who'd signed it had any authority to do so. Some accounts say that these men were councillors of the sachems. Others don't mention they had any status at all. All they could really do was take the treaty to their sachems, but the sachems wouldn't feel bound by the terms. But it did give the colonies something to hold over the Narragansett. Governor Winslow, whose grip on events had been slipping even before Philip vanished into thin air, was relieved by the Narragansett Treaty. He clung to it as proof that soon the powerful Indian nation would join the war and bring about the destruction of Philip. By the 16th of July, the colonists had concluded that Philip must have found refuge in Pocasset. So Church landed on the shores of Pocasset with a force of more than 100 men. He brought with him native interpreters and guides, including possibly Mamanua, who we met last time, the son who tried to sell his mother's land. Soon after they set out, the colonists spotted 2 Indian men. They shot one and captured the other, and the other was tortured for information. by a praying Indian from Nemaskett called Thomas Hunter. Hunter did his grisly work well, and soon the prisoner pointed to where they could find both Philip and his sister-in-law, Weetamoo. The helpful man was executed, and then the army set off into the swamp. Now given the choice, Church's target was the Sonsqua of the Pocasset, Weetamoo. Earlier, we talked about the importance of the house for colonial ideas. Well, in English eyes, the opposite of a colonial house wasn't an Indian village, but the swamp. The word itself has possible roots in Old English or German, but the modern English word emerged from the first colonial reports. A swamp could be waterlogged and boggy, or more like a moor, but it was always overgrown with trees and bushes, hard to navigate, especially on horseback, and unsuitable for agriculture. The English could do nothing with a swamp, whereas the Indians appeared right at home in them. Swamp became a verb, something Native Americans did. Colonists wrote about Indians swamping themselves, disappearing into the overgrowth like ghosts, where the English would not or could not follow. For Native Americans all along the eastern seaboard, swamps were safe havens where women, children, and the old could take shelter during conflicts, particularly with Europeans. They were extremely easy to defend, perfect terrain for ambushing numerically superior forces. Increase Mather even declared that every swamp is a castle to them. But the English saw nothing permanent, homely, or civilized in a swamp. It was just somewhere the natives went to hide, a base from which to raid good, God-fearing English towns, a place where they could snipe and ambush English soldiers. There was nothing sacred in a swamp. Something which would be an outrage if done to a proper English town, like burning it down, destroying food, or killing its inhabitants, was perfectly acceptable in a swamp. And yes, that's foreshadowing. But not right now. Because the Wampanoag and the Pocasset had had several days to prepare for the English arrival. They'd seen Church's force land, and even with native guides, there were only so many paths through the swamp. As the soldiers marched deeper into the undergrowth, boots squelching in the mud, their lines of sight reduced to a few feet in front and behind them, the cry of a hawk rang out. Then a hail of bullets rained out of the trees and the bushes. It was an ambush, executed flawlessly. The militia fired volleys of shot into the undergrowth, not aiming at anything in particular, and with no idea if they'd even hit anything. When the rear guard tried to fall back, they found bullets flying that way too. They'd marched right by camouflaged fighters who'd held their nerve and their fire until now, when it could do the most damage. The path forward was unblocked, though, and Church bellowed for his men to keep moving. To stay still was to die. Once they finally broke free of the ambush, Church's forces emerged into a Pocasset encampment. And no one was there. The ambush had bought time for Weetamoo to lead the young, sick and old out the back, deeper into the swamp. Church's quarry had gone to ground. All that was left were cooking pots, tents, and a smouldering fire. After fighting their way back the way they'd come, the militia emerged from the swamp with a relatively low casualty number, only 2 dead and 4 injured. For all the fear, danger, death, and time spent tramping through the mud, Church had brought out of the swamp a kettle. It had been a disappointing start of the war for Josiah Winslow. The Plymouth governor had envisioned a swift victory, where Montauk would be taken by surprise, Philip killed or captured in a brief skirmish, and Wampanoag resistance to colonial supremacy finally, forever, broken. Instead, Winslow had been one step behind from the start. Reports were reaching him that towns and settlements all over New England had been attacked, people killed, and houses burned to the ground. Even worse, Church's foray into Pocasset had made clear that Weetamoo, and the 300 men under her command, had thrown in their lot with Philip. Winslow had missed his chance of a quick war, and now even the seasons were turning against him. The fields needed planting, and the men who usually did that work had been mustered for military service and spent the last few weeks fruitlessly marching through the wilderness, getting shot at by trees and their own side. Winslow gave the order to demobilise most of the militia so they could go home and work their fields. The rest, around 100, were to stay under arms and unite with the Massachusetts militia and the colonists' native allies, including members of the Massachusetts. The war may not have been won with a quick decapitation strike, but Winslow and the colonists weren't beaten. Not by a long shot. Next week, the war will expand. The English will invade Pocasset Swamp once again, and other nations will join the war, some on the side of the colonists, others joining with Philip. And with lines being drawn in the sand, Christianized Indians will pay the price for having a foot in both worlds. Thank you to my Patreon House of Lords, which has been joined by Earl Sean Moriarty, Earl Stan Dixon, and Earl Johnson. They join the illustrious ranks of supporters who help keep this podcast going, including the King's favourites Mike Sanders and Jarrow Katowski, Damien, Duke of Portland, Rory Martin, the Marquis of Clarence, and Earl Kieran Gore. Thank you to all of my patrons, including those I've mentioned above and those I haven't. If you're not a patron and you're on the fence about becoming one, for just $5 a month, or equivalent currency, you can listen to this episode and every other episode ad-free. Patrons also receive the monthly Britannica Gazette Q&A and a Patreon-only chat room. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica for more information. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music used in this episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.